How much of a threat are reform to Labour?
So, look, I think people need to be clear what they're voting for if they're considering voting for reform, because
that's an answer with respect to a completely different question. How much of a threat is reform to Labour?
Making racist comments. Those are the types of people who are standing as candidates for the Reform Party.
It was nice to see a Sky News host making this Labour woman look ridiculous. She asked her a simple question about the threat from reform at these elections, and she goes off on a rant about reform being a bunch of racists who want to privatise the NHS. Labour is clearly terrified by reform and has no response except to smear them. She brings up an instance of a previous reform candidate who said some vile things about Rishi Sunak's family. Reform got rid of that person and condemned the comments, as if Labour or any other party hasn't had people who have said extreme stuff before. The Liberal establishment has gone so far left that, to them, reform is Britain's version of the Third Reich. Anyone who doesn't want open borders and new housing estates built to house illegal men is considered a Nazi. The British people wouldn't go anywhere near reform if they were truly far right. The fact they are doing so well shows they are not far right. Labour doesn't understand that this anti-British liberalism is completely out of control, and people are sick of it being forced down their throats as they get poorer. Unfortunately for Labour, this woman's smear campaign didn't work because reform did really well, winning in Runcorn, and now they have a reform mayor for Lincolnshire. Take a watch.
A weird mix. The thing that I am really going to be looking out for from them is reform, because it feels to me like this is a big test about whether they can convert votes into seats. And if they do manage that at council level, then that obviously has an impact on the general election as well. How much of a threat are reform to Labour?
So, look, I think people need to be clear what they're voting for if they're considering voting for reform, because
that's an answer with respect to a completely different question. How much of a threat is reform to Labour?
So, look, I go out door knocking every week in my own constituency, and my personal experience has been that the polling results that you see reported in the news isn't reflected in the conversations that you have.
What's your constituency?
So I represent Swindon in Wiltshire, so it was a seat that I won off of the Conservatives in July of last year. It was a seat where Reform came third. And so, you know, my experience is that the poll numbers aren't necessarily reflected on the doorstep.
So
but what I would say is that, you know, people that are considering voting for reform, they need to be, you know, clear what they're voting for. You know, Nigel Farage's party is a party that will insist that you whip your credit card out when you get to the door of A&E, or that you take a bank loan out if you want to have your hip replaced.
Can I make an observation? Because whenever I ask Labour MPs about reform, every Labour MP comes to me with that line on the NHS, which makes me feel that that is a number 10 line. And that makes me feel that Labour are worried about reform, that number 10 are worried about reform, and that they're telling you the lines to take.
I'm just telling you the truth, Sophie. I'm telling you the truth. I'm telling you the truth about what reform stand for. I could also tell you.
You're telling me about the NHS thing because that's been polled by number 10 as damaging to Nigel Farage. And I'm not saying whether it's true or not.
Also because Nigel Farage has stood up and said he wants to move to an insurance-based health system.
I'm not disputing that. But I guess what I am disputing is that I do think Labour are worried about reform. That's fair enough, you know, like you've got a very broad but shallow coalition. You're facing reform in an awful lot of seats. It would be natural. They're leading the polls.
So
There's no shame in it.
We fight for every single vote, and I will always be honest about what my opponents are standing for, and I'm just being honest with you about that. I would also say, you know, if you look at the candidates that Reform were fielding before the general election last year, making racist comments, you know, things about Rishi Sunak, who was then the Prime Minister, and I've got no love lost between me and Rishi Sunak, but I do think he was completely right when he stood up and said that his daughters shouldn't have to grow up in a country where people who are standing for public office are using such vile and racist language. And we actually saw Nigel Farage sort of having to distance himself from that. But those are the types of people who are standing as candidates for the Reform Party. They had, 4 or 5 MPs in the House of Commons. One of them's already been booted out. So they're fighting like rats in a sack at the moment. I would say that if people are considering how they're going to vote at the election tomorrow in these council elections, vote for a serious party that's committed to improving the delivery of public services in your area and will be able to work with the Labour government to bring about the change that people undoubtedly want to see.
Who's more of a threat, Reform or the Conservatives?
Well, the Conservatives seem to not even be on the pitch in some of these elections. And what we don't know is about these sort of grubby backroom deals that they seem to be doing between one another. Robert Jenrick, the Shadow Justice Secretary, was recorded recently, wasn't he, as saying that he, potentially wants to, go into coalition with Reform or something like that. And so people don't really know what they're voting for. If you're voting for Conservative, you might be getting Reform. If you're voting for Reform, you might be getting Conservative. And so, I think that, politics is quite volatile.